is the Ship of Gold program. This has been a touring show like vaudeville, and Bob Evans, to my right, to your left, is the scientist, rocket scientist. You might even call him, well, the Miami paper called him something, and he'll tell you what that is a little later, toward the end of his show. But Bob's a nice guy as a human being, but he was the rocket scientist that founded Central America. And I've said this many times before, I think he's sort of like Neil Armstrong. There will never be a treasure greater than the Central America ever found anywhere, because there was never a treasure lost greater than the Central America anywhere. In terms of numismatic content, it was lost during the tail end of the gold rush, with gold rush coins and memorabilia on it, assay ingots and everything else. And just something incredible. The Ship of Gold was, as you'll find out, was found by Bob and his associates, brought to market by the California Gold Marketing Group. I wrote a book which is available at the Whitman booth and elsewhere, or on loan from the ANA Library. It's Gem and Mineral Show in Tucson, Arizona, which is world famous and brings people from all over the world. And their theme was 50-year anniversary, emphasis on gold. And they had the Ship of Gold exhibit, and this was the program we hope that you'll be able to see today, plus a facade model of the ship and some exhibits. And there were tens of thousands of people attending the show. The show had been there for 50 years. They had had the Forbes Fabergé eggs there one year. They had the Hope Diamond there another year. So it was a big, powerful international show. This was the first year in their history that they had to have crowd control. They had to put up tapes in the zigzag. People would, sometimes the line would be 150 feet long waiting to do this already. But anyway, gold was discovered at Sutter's Fort and the Sacramento Sutter Sawmill, built by employees of Mr. Sutter on the American River. And on January 24th, 1848, James Marshall saw a little flake of gold, or it could be a nugget, there are many different descriptions, in the mill race where the water ran to turn the mill wheel, was supposed to run. It had just been scooped out, and then they turned the water in to run through it through the night and help clear out gravel. And the next morning he saw a little flake, picked it up, and it looked bright, and no gold had ever been discovered in the area before. He looked at it. He took another rock and hit it and flattened it. It flattened, but he still didn't know. He took it to Sutter's Fort, which was a good half-day horse ride distance. The headquarters in the area in Sacramento, and went to John Sutter, who was a Swiss who had moved to California in 1839. And he said, "Look what I found," and they took an encyclopedia to try to find out what gold was. I mean, was it gold? Because it could be pyrite or any sorts of things. And made a few tests, and they thought it was gold. Then they found more. They found more things in the mill race. And Sutter said, talked to his employees, well, this might be just temporary. The employment here at Sutter's Mill is permanent. Don't tell people about it. Let's get this mill done. But they kept finding more and more gold. All the workers, it became more attractive than putting up the sawmill. And then somebody went into San Francisco, Sam Brannan, who was a Mormon leader and somewhat uncertain reputation with the Mormon Church. But Sam Brannan got involved, went into San Francisco and said, "There's been gold found." And anyway, within a very short time, by late spring, all of San Francisco, which was a small community at the time, stores were deserted, the newspapers closed down, because if you could find $50, $100, $200 worth of gold per day, which was possible at the time, that was much more attractive than working for $1 a day wages. And so San Francisco became depopulated. The gold rush was on. The news reached the East in late 1848 and became very exciting after December 1848, when President Polk, in his annual message, said that the gold discovery is real, the Treasury Department has seen gold, and there's a bonanza in California. This is December 1848. It's cold in the east, but immediately, in fact, even beginning before that, but going into fever pitch, companies were formed, and that's what they were called, companies. A group would meet in like Lowell, Massachusetts, and they'd say, we're having an organizational meeting on January 5th. So people show up and you would buy shares in this company. Many of the companies had boards of directors and bylaws. They had rules like who is to do the cooking, who is to do this. They bought containers for storing gold. They had discussions. One of the companies had a discussion that they found, they took one ship with them. If they found too much gold, they would be able to buy another ship to carry the gold back. All sorts of devices were sold in the East, inventions for finding gold. So without doing much work, you put dirt in here and gold comes out. It didn't really work out that way. So all these different companies formed. They would charter ships. They were usually wrecks of ships, and they would go to California one of two ways. And here again, this is 1849 by ship. They would go to Panama, which was very rugged at the time, cross 48 miles of land, jungle, rivers, and malaria and everything else, wind up in the Pacific coast, and then hope to catch another steamer on an occasional trip up to San Francisco. There were steamships running, but before the gold rush, there wasn't much trade, so they didn't have too active of a situation. Often they would get to the west coast, that's the Pacific side, and there would be no ships. A couple people in the annals of California actually endeavored to row from Panama to San Francisco. Others, more of them went around the Horn. You would get a tired old sailing ship, not too much in the way of steamships, and you would buy it or rent it and go around Cape Horn and come up the other side and reach San Francisco. The time reaching San Francisco varied depending on the wind and the ship. I think the all-time record for a clipper ship later, these are high performance extreme clipper ships, was something like 89 days or 90 days with with a great crew and a trained crew. But normally the trip seems to have taken maybe 120 days, 130 days, fraught with disasters and all sorts of things. One lady went to San Francisco, was on ship number 1, which got wrecked or burned. One on ship number 2 got stranded, and finally on the 3rd ship reached San Francisco. When I did a book on this for the Central America, I tried to read everything possible, so you get to hear all these interesting things. Then you had the overland route for the 49ers, the wagons, which what you call Conestoga wagons, like you see in the movies. These were also companies that would form. They would sell, although some people went individually. Most people wanted to go as a company. They wanted some able-bodied men. Maybe they took their families along and said the daughters and wives would cook. And they formed into groups. They didn't know what to expect, whether there would be wild Indians or whatever. But in the spring, all the thousands and thousands of wagon trains gathered on the other side of the Mississippi River in Missouri, in Independence, Missouri primarily, waiting for the grass to grow. The oxen mainly, but there were also horses, were pulling the wagons, and the spring grass hadn't come up yet, and nobody had any food. I mean, they didn't have enough food for the animals. So they had to wait till the grass grew. And when this happened, there were long, long lines of people heading westward. They were playing the banjo like O Susanna. They would stop at night. They would sing. They took a lot of things with them. They would take like carved furniture, cast iron stoves, pianos, minting equipment sometimes, all sorts of things. Just so they could live in luxury, they thought. And everything went well for the flat areas. And then they started getting around Utah and especially Nevada, where you had alkali flats, very, very little grass. You had to sometimes ford streams or the trails were rocky, and pretty soon things like pianos and cast iron stoves were dumped overboard. Wagons would break their axles or shed a tire, they called them tires, that they had no way of fixing them. They'd abandon wagons. Animals would become sick. people would become sick. Cholera swept through the wagon trains, and they would bury somebody in a shallow grave alongside the trail, and then somebody come along 2 weeks later and they see where wolves had dug up the shallow grave, and there must have been somebody buried there. Anyway, only 1 out of 10 wagons approximately that left from the east ever made it in wagon form with all their stuff in California. One of the first places, the gold rush became very popular. It became the pivotal point of the world. There were private minters in March 1854. The San Francisco Mint opened. In 1857, it had been open for several years. The coins and ingots were being made, and California was the world's source of gold. Thanks.
I got called onto the SS Central America project from the opposite side of the world, which was a batch of lawyers calling me cold in my office one day. Picked up the phone without any idea what was happening, and all of a sudden I have a conference call with 4 lawyers, and the next thing you know there's 7, and the next thing you know there's 10, and we're going along for about an hour, and it kept proceeding, and I thought, boy, this is really interesting. They're asking me about the gold business because I ran 2 open pit gold mines, and I was responsible for day-to-day sales of the gold from our mine. I've been a student of California Gold Rush and followed California banking history and gold transaction history since the beginning of the Gold Rush for a whole lot of reasons. I was way involved in that. And so they kept asking all these great questions about all this stuff that I loved, and it was real true to my heart and that I had spent my entire career working on. And I said, what's all this about, finally, after an hour and a half? And the guy says, well, we represent the insurance companies for the SS Central America, and we've been looking for you for a few years, and we just found you. But we didn't know who you were. And at that point, they brought me in and said that the federal court had asked them to find an independent expert to look at the treasure and tell the court what it was, and that the insurance companies were in charge of paying for it, and they thought since they're paying for it, they wanted somebody who might know what he's doing. So with that in mind, we started an interesting dance or tennis match, if you will, on the telephone. Bob and I did, because we had 2 professionals, and their side, of course, was leery of what the insurance company side might be doing or if there was any game playing. And he didn't know until later that there wasn't any game playing, because I was completely independent and brought in independently. And the first time we met each other, it was quite interesting. But we got along from the get-go immediately, and the first thing that the insurance company asked me to do as soon as I saw the first bar was tell them, is this real? Is it real gold? And of course I called them on the spot and said it's real gold. And the rest is pretty much history. We logged in everything. Bob had to put up with me telling him all about the gold business and ingots and how they're made and how they're poured and why they're marked that way, and he had to listen to all that, the poor guy.
I was happy to get the information.
But somebody had to.
People often ask me how I got involved in this, because I was a Midwestern geologist when it all started. And Tommy Thompson, the founder of the project, was literally my neighbor. So some things start on a very grassroots, basic level. And that is what happened here. The SS Central America was about the length of a football field. 280 feet overall. It was a hybrid technology at the time where they had adapted a sailing ship design, this being known as a brigantine. Had 1 square-rigged foremast, and the mainmast and mizzenmast were fore and aft rigged. The sails on board such a steamship were mostly used to trim the vessel to make sure that the paddle wheels plied evenly into the waves. So just keeping it upright was the main purpose. It carried to the bottom the greatest lost treasure in our nation's history. There isn't anything else that's even quite close. At the time, a listed commercial shipment amounted to $1.219 million, with gold at $20.67 to the ounce. I can't imagine. it was said that the passengers probably had an equal or greater amount of gold in their possession at the time. This was a lithograph at the time that actually misinterpreted the wreck. It was rather fanciful, but it shows the Central America with two stacks. It only had one. Didn't matter. It was dramatic, and it was a popular lithograph at the time. Gleaming at the bottom of the ocean were mint state double eagles and various other kinds of gold mixed in with the coal, broken pottery, and other effects of the shipwreck after 130 years. This is the way we found it. A lot of what I'm going to speak about over the next few minutes has to do with how we found it, but David Bowers has already covered most of the gold rush. So I'm going to be rather quick about the way I skip forward here. There is another talk here at 4. Life magazine said I was looking for pirates or bad weather here. I was actually looking for the supply boat that was bringing fresh vegetables. We had run out and we were eating canned corn, and it was not fun. Often we were offshore for a month or more and then would look for periods of bad weather so that we could come ashore at a time when we would not be missing operational time on the site. About 180 miles off the coast, in an area that here is labeled as the Outer Drift. This is also known as the Blake Ridge, and the closest point of land is up here at Cape Fear, North Carolina, although we're about the latitude of Georgia, actually. Fascinating area of the ocean. Had never really been visited repeatedly by any kind of expeditions or cameras or anything else when we first started this project. As I said, David has already covered most of the business about the California Gold Rush. This was the original announcement in the Californian, a newspaper that went out of business the next week when the publisher went to look for gold. I like the part down at the bottom. Being a scientist, I like great chances here for scientific capitalists. It's nice to be inspired by your material. It started out on a rather low-key thing. The locals, those trappers and such who were around, had heard about the gold rush, but shortly it became a huge burgeoning population as tens of thousands of mostly young men flooded into California. California has the distinction of being the only state that went from being a possession, completely skipped over territorial status, and went directly to being a state. This from the flood of people, some of whom struck it rich, many more of whom settled down into groups of men, and mining companies began to do amazing things. This was not only a great time of industry, but also California's first environmental disaster. As here we see men digging out the bed of a river and completely diverting it down the left bank, the right on your screen, but fascinating time of great activity in the foothills of the Sierra. Gold was, of course, not money yet. It was just gold. It was rocks. It needed to be weighed, assayed, and its value determined. And in fact, we have evidence of that from the SS Central America that serves as a benchmark for the creation of those kinds of ingots and artifacts. The overland routes, David has already told us colorful stories about that. When I was a youth in Ohio, this was how we thought everyone went to California. Whereas actually the maritime routes were far more important for commerce. This is the way the U.S. mail went, particularly through the route through the Isthmus of Panama. It was the fastest way to get from New York to San Francisco once the steamships began plying it. This is the General Winfield Scott, of which we had the bell here moments ago, announcing, I guess prematurely announcing that my talk was about to begin. But that's an example of one of these steamships that, in this case, went between San Francisco and Panama. There was another steamship line owned by kind of shuffling the boards of directors of the steamship line that operated between Panama and New York City. And beginning in 1885, a railroad was completed across the isthmus, which now made it possible for both heavy equipment and genteel society to begin to flow into California. Men began to send for their wives and families, and now the trip was cut down to a mere 23 or 24 days. Now imagine a time when you have a United State that is disconnected from the rest of the states by 3.5 weeks. That's what we were dealing with here until the telegraph was strung across the country in the 1860s. Information flowed, as quick as possible, but nonetheless very slowly. It was a technological age, and people worshiped their technology. They had two key technologies that had just come online, which I've already mentioned. One was ocean steam navigation. For the very first time in human history, it was possible to schedule travel at sea over long distances. Yeah, will this help some of you hear a little better? And thanks. I'm relying on a lot of help here today and a lot of, forbearance. The second was the telegraph, where information now, at least where the telegraph was strung, could proceed and be transmitted at what they called the speed of lightning, as opposed to the speed of horse, which it had been restricted to for all of those millennia that people tried to contact people in distant places. So just as we think we live in a marvelous technological age, they thought they live in a marvelous technological age, and it seems like every age is a marvelous technological age. This was no exception. This shows the complete route and the way it was advertised in the broadsides and newspapers of the day. You had the United States Mail Steamship Company on the Atlantic side between New York and the American port of Aspinwall, which is now where Colon, Panama is. The transit of the isthmus by means of the railroad, and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company between Panama and San Francisco. The SS Central America had originally been christened the SS George Law, named for a member of the board of directors of the United States Mail Steamship Company, who actually quit the company shortly after that, but it continued as the George Law until early in 1857, when it was repaired and recoppered, the hull needing to be coppered for travel in the tropics, or else it would be eaten quickly by shipworms. And it was rechristened the SS Central America. At that time, the name Central America conjured up in people's minds something quite different from what it is now. It meant travel to California. It meant an exotic location. This was the first time the United States was really becoming embroiled in Central American affairs, and may also be responsible for why many of those countries still feel the way they do about us. In charge of the SS Central America was the United States Naval Commander, Commander William Lewis Herndon. Lewis Herndon was a famous man in his own right at that time, having in the early 1850s explored the valley of the Amazon for the Department of the Navy. He and his intrepid band of sailors actually went down to Peru, traveled up over the Andes, built boats, and floated down the length of the Amazon, mapping it for the very first time. And it contains a lot of colorful accounts of both their travels and both the geographical and ethnographical sorts of things that they encountered on the way. And it is a marvelous work, and Herndon was a very fine author who, it turns out that there was a young Samuel Clemens, we know as Mark Twain, who read this book and said later in his life that it had inspired him to take up his life of travels and such. And so it was an important and influential work in its own right. Captain Herndon would entertain various of the first cabin guests at his dinner table. This fine gentleman is Judge Alonzo Castle Munson, a federal district judge in Sacramento, who was not only known for his judicial, wisdom would be a good word, but also for some of his personal habits. He was a famous gambler, having once lost his house in a poker game. Interesting characters in early California. I guess it really hasn't changed from the Midwestern perspective, if you'll pardon me. Here's a fine, upstanding Midwestern family that I will say a brief word about. Rufus Allen Lockwood, not his real name, was a lawyer. It turns out that he read for the Massachusetts bar under the name of Rufus Allen Lockwood, which was actually the name of his recently deceased cousin. His real name was Nathaniel Jessup, and young Nathaniel had deserted in his young days both the Army and the Navy, thus needing to cover his tracks there. But Rufus Allen Lockwood then moved to the west, in this case Lafayette, Indiana, with his then wife and soon-to-be family. And in Lafayette, Indiana, he built his house on the county line. I guess that he was kind of a shady lawyer, let's put it that way, although he was a very talented one. He wanted to be on the county line, so depending on whether or not the sheriff of one county or the other was coming to see him, he could receive him in his parlor or his sitting room and not be arrested. A circuit judge who was working in the circuit court there took umbrage at some of Rufus Allen Lockwood's antics, and Rufus decided it was time to up, and he moved to New Orleans, where he became familiar with French and Napoleonic law, which is the foundation of state law in Louisiana. And lo and behold, a year later, the same judge shows up as part of the circuit court there, and Rufus Allen Lockwood decides it's time to move on again, and he moved to Mexico City, whereupon he learned all about Spanish and Mexican law, particularly law, and he became a title lawyer there. So when gold was discovered in California, which had been a former Mexican territory, he was a much in demand title lawyer to land issues in California and became the lawyer of many prominent citizens, including Colonel Fremont and others. He had a habit of disappearing, unexplained disappearances. Early in the 1850s, once he was gone for almost a year and came back with tales of having been a shepherd in Australia and having been in the courts of Europe. And this habit of disappearing occasionally, I guess finally it reached its conclusion when the SS Central America sank. His wife Harriet and his youngest daughter, who were on board the Central America as well, were rescued, and Harriet Lockwood refused to go into mourning, even though her husband did not show up after the wreck, realizing that he could show up any day anyway. So she never wore black and never went into mourning over this man. Little Alice Lockwood was one of the last passengers on board the Central America to dine. After they left Havana on their way to New York in their last stretch, they began to be steaming into the fringes of a storm. And these storms were incompletely understood at that time. It was not known that hurricanes were definitely the cyclonic, circular sorts of things that we now know them to be. In fact, some people thought that, okay, the wind would rush with great fury from the northeast to the southwest. Somehow or other it piled up there, then there was a period of calm, and then all the wind came rushing back. Thus, that would be the observations of someone that the eye would pass over them, and that was what they saw in the wind. So actually it was the advent of the telegraph and simultaneous observations of the weather at different points that allowed hurricanes to be understood as the circular phenomena that they are. Anyway, on Thursday, September 10th, 1857, Alice Lockwood and her little friend Alice Pahood took their noon meal, whereas nobody else was. It was pitching so violently that nobody particularly wanted to eat at that point. And these two little girls, it was said, were laughing merrily as the dishes went dashing and crashing about the table and such. And they were probably driving their parents crazy, but that's the nature of children. That afternoon, shortly after that meal, the engines stopped. The ship was listing badly, and somehow or other water was leaking into the bottom. The captain immediately ordered that all able-bodied men on board were to get busy bailing the ship. You see, with the engines stopped, none of the mechanical pumps would work. They all operated off of steam power, and so sort of a deadly domino effect was created by this. The coal got wet and the steam pressure was lost. The pumps would not work, and so the only way to possibly save the ship was to bail the water out of the hull, get the coal dryer, and get the boilers fired up again. These men worked diligently at this for 30 hours before the ship ultimately sank. And so we see a real distinction between this shipwreck and, say, the Titanic, where there was a distinct class distinction between the steerage passengers and the first-class passengers. This, from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, shows a first cabin passenger working right alongside the men in the ruder miner's clothes. None of these folks who were passengers on the Central America were poor by any means. It cost $125 to travel in steerage from San Francisco to New York, with gold at $20 an ounce, or roughly so, and $300 in first cabin. So it wasn't a cheap ride. On September 12th, 1857, as the ship was sinking lower and lower, and there was little chance of hope, a damaged brig, the brig Marine out of Boston, which was carrying molasses from somewhere in Cuba. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the port right now. But anyway, it was Cuban molasses they were carrying to New York. Sailed into view. This was a small sailing vessel that had been, like I said, damaged itself by the storm. But nonetheless, it wasn't in danger of sinking, whereas the Central America was. See, the huge engines on board the Central America were part of the demise, because it sank lower and lower in the water because it had an extra 750 tons of iron on board. The engines were huge because they had to operate at low steam pressure. The brig Marine normally had a captain and 3 crew members. And over the course of the next 6 hours, first all the women and children, and then many of the men, were conveyed to the relative safety of the brig Marine. 100 people were rescued by this vessel that normally carried 4. So they were also in some danger of, using up all the food and other such things. But a very heroic rescue in the waning fringes of the storm. That evening at 8 o'clock, Captain Herndon stood on the paddle box of the SS Central America and fired a rocket out diagonally, indicating to all who could see it that they were about to sink. And moments later, it was engulfed by the waves, casting 480-some men into the water in a time when people did not usually swim for recreation. They were all grasping at bits of flotsam and such, anything that would keep them afloat. Before the ship had sunk, everybody, or almost everybody anyway, had thrown their gold away, because that wasn't going to help you swim either. Gold being roughly 18 times heavier than water, or the kind of gold they were carrying anyway. Quite the scene. In the middle of the night, about 6 hours after they sank, a Norwegian bark, this is a 3-masted sailing vessel, slightly larger than the brig Marine, but a small vessel itself, sailed into the midst, and the captain said that I heard cries from the night, and I discovered that I was in the midst of men who had been shipwrecked. And over a course of about 8 hours, they managed to rescue another 50 men from the water. Truly a providential rescue for these guys who really had no possible hope of surviving at that point without such a thing happening. There were others who were still alive. Life raft had been made out of a portion of the hurricane deck, which is the uppermost, the tops of the houses on the main deck. And they floated for a total of 8 days and 20 hours till they were rescued over 400 miles north of the spot where it sank. This was both a very harrowing tale and an amazing tale of survival in the high seas, but also a key clue to the fact that they must have been in the Gulf Stream, and thus a locational clue for us as we went about trying to locate the wreck. The loss of all that gold and furthermore the psychological damage it did to the markets was tremendous. The financial markets in New York were already reeling from the fact that certain companies were collapsing due to over-speculation in Western railroad stocks, the Western being like Missouri and Kansas at this point. It's interesting, there was a West and then there was California. They were two distinctly different things. But the panic of 1857 proceeded completely downhill from there, the greatest financial panic of the 19th century, which really didn't abate until sometime in the Civil War and continued on from there. Captain Herndon, because of his heroism in maintaining order on board and managing to rescue the women and children, is memorialized at Annapolis. In 1858, they erected this obelisk. Are there any members of or graduates of the U.S. Naval Academy here at all? I don't see any hands, so I'll go on and tell my own story and not let them do it. The cannons that are sitting around the monument here are pointed downward into the ground, actually symbolically indicating that he was a peacetime hero. He is the only such peacetime naval hero who is honored in such a prominent way at Annapolis. He's also honored every year because the Herndon Monument becomes the scene for one of their annual rites of passage. The plebes, or the freshmen, if you will, at the U.S. Naval Academy, strip to their skivvies and try to climb the greased Herndon Memorial. The idea being that the first midshipman to place his or her cap on top of the memorial will be the first admiral of the graduating class. At least that's what they tell them. I hear that this can take as little as 20 to 25 minutes, or it can take as long as 3 hours, depending on their state of organization. I don't know what these guys down at the bottom become. Maybe they become like just simple lieutenants. We were able to use there were 33 accounts of the Central America from the survivors, passing ship captains and such, which contained what we called critical path information that could be used to reconstruct the physics of the final hours. Coordinates, something about the wind, something about the condition of the vessel, any of these kinds of things that could help us reconstruct the physics were constructed into a large spreadsheet, which we called a matrix, and delivered to Larry Stone, who is a PhD in mathematics, who wrote the book called The Theory of Optimal Search. Dr. Stone's algorithms are used by Coast Guard search and rescue. They're used to locate submarines that sink or ships that sink in a modern sense, but this was the first time that a historical database had been used by him in order to reconstruct the probable location of a sunken historical ship. Well, he uses some complicated mathematics, and there won't be a quiz next period. So, I was able, as I said, from the information to reconstruct the effects that the storm may have had on the sinking vessel. The wind-driven current here is being calculated at various points in the storm and the vectors involved. And what you end up with is what is known as a probability map. This is a modern treasure map, although it isn't like printed on parchment and burnt around the edges with a big red X someplace or whatever. But we have two areas of higher probability, these representing clustered around two of the main coordinates, or the forward projection of two of the main coordinates that were reported. And I'm often asked, well, did you find it in here or did you find it in here? And actually we found it over in here. But the neat thing about search theory is it tells you that when you don't find it where you fully expect to, it tells you where to look afterwards. And it was found, or imaged anyway, on our 40-day imaging trip in 1986 with side-scanning sonar. To work on such a vessel, you need an ocean-going research vessel such as ours here, the RV Arctic Discoverer. And it's decked out with all kinds of things. It's got satellite domes for both positioning and communications. It's got cranes for the launching of equipment. It's got a large winch. It has of course, it has an intrepid crew. This is Mike Williamson, who designed and operated the sonar, and Commander Don Kraft, retired U.S. Navy, who was instrumental in some of the early work on the project. Sonar makes an interesting picture. This is not a picture of the SS Central America. That is still proprietary because it's our best map of the site. But this shows you sort of how it works. There's a bottle-shaped or ship-shaped outline showing where the hull is around it, and a shadow behind it, which will actually tell us something about the height of the ship. This is Nemo, the robot we used to work on the site. Nemo weighed roughly 6 tons and was equipped with all sorts of thrusters, cameras, manipulators, various hydraulic gizmos, sonars, all kinds of neat stuff by the very talented engineers that I worked with. Here it is, Nemo is going into the water. Actually, I believe Nemo is coming up out of the water here, but it will serve its purpose for my talk anyway. And this is us out on the deep blue sea. Sometimes the deep blue sea gets a little angrier, and we're being beat up a bit there. To locate ourselves on the bottom, we use things called transponders. These chirp to each other at various frequencies, and the computers can sort out the different frequencies of the chirping from the transponders in order to triangulate and determine our location on the bottom once we've determined our location on the top, to a matter of about a meter or so, rather accurate. This is what the control room roughly looked like. We've got a pilot and co-pilot in the front, the navigator, Alan Skyt's in the back. This is our photographer, and this is me logging it all in on our laptop computers. It didn't go without incident. In 1987, as we were doing our first recovery work at sea, this was a competitor that came out, and he is actually, it's foreshortened a bit because this was taken from our supply airplane that was out dropping electronic parts and fresh newspapers to us so we could find out what the rest of the outside world was doing. We were far more concerned with what our local community was doing at this point. This was it was Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory that was out there working for a client towing sonar. Basically, we were 1 year ahead of everybody, and this was important. As it turned out, we were able to gain rights to an injuncted area and able to proceed with our project without any further interference. But it was a dicey month of July in 1987. The site itself showed us marvelous things, and I'm going to breeze through this pretty quick because we don't have too much time, and I want to show some gold. This is the paddle wheel that Captain Herndon stood on to fire his final rocket. Some of the creatures that lived on it were rather exotic and strange and wonderful, like these 13-armed starfish, which you'll see a lot of in the next few slides. This is the rudder of the SS Central America. You notice that all the wood has been eaten out of the inside of this copper cladding that was around the outside of it. There were deep ocean shipworms, essentially, that consumed most of the wood, except where it had been sufficiently poisoned by the copper. Another starfish and one of the hanging knees, which once supported a deck, like a big gusset on the ship. More starfish. A marvelous octopus that we found down there that the biologists told us they could not describe it as a new species unless we sampled it, that is to say, killed it and brought it up. We didn't. Too wonderful of a creature. Rather large. The head of this octopus is about the size of a volleyball, and it's about 6 feet tip to tip. So a good-sized octopus. This is a passenger trunk. We recovered 2 of them, not this one, and found wonderful arrays of artifacts in those that also went to academia and and various marvelous studies on both costume history and materials degradation in the deep ocean. This was a wonderful sponge, which we nicknamed the Sydney Opera House for obvious reasons. And in fact, in our logs, you can find various times, we use this as almost a navigational checkpoint for ourselves. When the logging in says that we are near Sydney, we knew where we were. We were within sight of the Sydney Opera House sponge. The Sydney Opera House sponge turned out to be a living fossil. There were no previously known living representatives of this, although there were fossils of it. So here in the deep ocean, we were finding, much like the coelacanth fish and other sorts of things, that this species was still alive. This sponge was actually a whole new genus and astounded the people who actually study things like hexactinellid sponges. Not a great thrill to people who don't know what they're looking at, but a tremendous thrill to people who do study that. There was a lot of coal on the site, remnants of wood in certain areas, and some places, such as in this photo, there were little bits of yellow gleaming out at us. As we move in on this piece, we see that it is a structure that we called the gargoyle, which is a beam of the hull of the Central America that is jutting out about 4 feet above the seabed, and it's literally dripping with double eagles. An amazing sight. Other amazing sights were nearby. As we see here, the biology of the area don't seem to care that they've got like multi-million-dollar houses. They're living right on top of blocks of gold. In fact, one of the scientists at the Smithsonian who described this species, this is known as Chrysogorgia, which means golden coral. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. Chrysogorgia means golden coral, and he said this was the first case that he knew of golden coral growing on blocks of gold. This was an area that we ultimately ended up calling the Garden of Gold, although you can also see here a few silver coins, and this is actually gold dust back here. You can find all of this sorts of material out on the Bourse floor downstairs. In amazing circumstances, you can see the things moving on. Originally, there were boxes that contained all of this, and the boxes have all been eaten away. You could see how they're still stacked as if they are in boxes. Some places, the seabed was literally carpeted with gold and original rolls of coins, strange and wonderful creatures, and truly a marvelous sight. We could actually zoom in on some of these coins and read the dates and mint marks, and we knew that we were dealing with lots and lots of 1857 S double eagles. Again, this is a scene of the bottom, and you can see lots of different, there's actually about 5 different phyla of animals that are represented here. We have barnacles, we have echinoderms, we have corals, we have starfish, we have, these are the cases that used to line the burrows of the animals that ate the wood of the shipworms. So this back here is a tee marker from a golf driving area, you know, where you tee up to go. These were dropped as sort of navigational beacons for us as well. We distributed these around so that we could triangulate off of them and make sure we knew where we were. We picked up a lot of this biology just in the course of working on the gold. A lot of really nice science was able to ride piggyback on this, and we ended up with 12 new species, as well as species that were now shown to be living fossils, as well as being able to observe many species for the very first time alive. They'd been pulled up in deep ocean dredges, but they had never been seen in their living condition before. We did a feeding experiment just for the fun of it. We ate pretty well out there because it was one of the few things we had to look forward to. We had a good chef. And so one night we had surf and turf. We had prime rib and we had lobster tail. And the next day, I got a piece of the leftovers of each, and we put them in these minnow traps, and we took them down to the bottom and deployed them. 11 days later, we picked them up, and these are known as Galatheid crabs. They look sort of like crayfish, if you will. And there were 4 of them on the prime rib, and there was 1 on the lobster tail. So they don't get beef very often down there, so I think it was a particular treat to them. I don't know if this experiment is repeatable, but at least that's what our results were when we did it. They were in marvelous shape and actually showed an almost tropical diversity in spite of the fact that there was, it's cold water down there. It was about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. We had, of the total of 5 crabs, we had 4 different species. And it was kind of surprising, as well as strange 6-armed starfish, which you can see here. This is one of these. And the marvelous condition of them is shown nowhere better than the fact that this particular female had eggs tucked under her tail. We did another feeding experiment where we took down about 50 pounds of fish heads from the local fish market. We had them frozen into a block and then wrapped them with netting and took them down there just to see what sort of other life might exist in the area and could be lured in, baited in. Here we have a fish known as a grenadier swimming over the top. And these are eels known as Simon Cayley's or monkey-faced eels that are burrowing into the pile of fish. A couple days later, they had a visitor of another sort as the deepest shark ever videoed came into sight, and this was a big one. It was a 21-foot Greenland shark. The outline that you see there is actually the footprint of Nemo, the robot, on the bottom, so we were able to measure off how long this beast was, and it was about 7 meters, and quite the fish. We picked up the gold with a variety of techniques. This was, most of the gold bars were picked up individually with rubberized manipulator jaws and placed into recovery modules, which you might, they suspiciously look like tool caddies from Kmart, which in fact they are. If you put a lead sheet in the bottom of a tool caddy from Kmart, and you give it a bungee handle so that you can like really grab a hold of it without crushing anything, they make a marvelous deep ocean recovery module for various things. Coins or small bars were picked up with a sort of a rubber cup suction picking device and placed individually into the recovery modules, which had been more finely divided. You can see we've divided that one at the top there into what was ultimately 24 different chambers instead of its original 3. Yes, here we are. Like you can see some of those again a little better. And we kept track of all of this, and I would rearrange them in my laboratory on board in the same mode in which they had been picked up, so that we could track on things. This has both eagles and double eagles in this photo here. It was a rather cramped quarters in the lab, but there was an awful lot of gold that moved through there, so I guess we did okay. The larger concentrations of coins, such as the one that this particular object is right over the top of, this was a technique borrowed from actually vertebrate paleontology. When you collect dinosaurs in the field, you find the bones, build a big plaster cast over what it is that's exposed, and then dig into the outcrop and bring it out as one big block in a technique known as block lifting. And we attempted that with the gold in certain instances. And this sequence here shows what happens. We put this lead-weighted, foam rubber-lined mold over the top, inject a silicone rubber compound into the interior of it. This congeals over a day or two. And so on the subsequent dive, we would pick these up and bring them up to the surface. And here we can see the coins encased in the silicone rubber as they arrived in the laboratory on board the ship. great way to pick up coins. I mean, we would get up to 300 or 400 at a time this way whenever we could, instead of having to pick them up one at a time with the suction picking device. This is Nemo on the deck of the ship with the drawer open, and here you can see that it's the drawer, which is hydraulically operated, and once you put the recovery modules inside of it and suck the drawer in, then it can safely travel to the surface without any fear of losing anything. This was quite a haul here. I bet we have 150, 200 pounds of gold bars in there. Our emphasis on science and history and technology and such elicited various responses. In 1989, which was actually the second year that we were working once we had found gold, we did minimal recoveries in '88, just enough to reinsure our investors that that their money was being properly applied. And in 1989, we announced it to the world. We had a reporter, Ken Ringel from the Washington Post, and a photographer come out to the ship on a supply boat and do a story on us. And then when he went back ashore, he put it out on the Washington Post wire. And it went all over the world. On September 15th in 1989, it appeared in both the Times of London. So we were right under the bannerhead of the arguably the top English-speaking paper in the world. At least the English would say so. And there's my picture. I'm looking at a 62-pound bar of gold, and a picture actually which we had earlier in the talk there. Back at home in the States, there were slightly more colorful representations of this, I guess. We loved this, actually. I mean, it made a distinction between the guys with the scuba tanks in the back of the station wagon and the truly technical operation that we were involved in. But nerds haul ocean riches. What a great headline. The numismatics of the find is quite fascinating, and the effect it has had. There were a lot of rumors. For various legal reasons, the inventories were withheld from the public for 10 years, which elicited some bad feelings among the numismatic community, but I'm afraid it was just necessary from a legal point of view. But we found, I guess, 15 or 16 of the octagonal $50 slugs, both from Augustus Humbert and from the assay office later. Various dates. This is a 1851 lettered edge variety of that, and a Lost Molitor 1855 $50, which was unique to the wreck. We only found one of those. One of the great finds, I guess, was the fact that we had these genuine assay ingots. And these have served as a benchmark against which all other ingots of the period can be measured. There are 5 key pieces of information on each and every one of these ingots. All 532 that came off the wreck had a serial number, manufacturer's serial number, the manufacturer's name, his maker's mark, in this case Kellogg and Humbert assayers, which were right over here on Montgomery Street in San Francisco. The number of ounces to the 100th of an ounce, the purity expressed as fine or parts per thousand, and the dollar value calculated at $20.67 to the ounce. And this plays out with each and every one of them. There were no exceptions to the rule. 5 different assayers. This was actually the original top surface of the pour after it is poured into the ingot mold, and as it cools, the central part of it cooling last has shrunk down, and there is a depression there. And the serial number is also stamped on the back so that there is no confusion when it comes out of the mold. Not every assayer did all of those steps. Some of them only stamped the last couple of digits of the serial number. Some of them didn't stamp the back of them at all. But Kellogg and Humbert stamped the backs and the full information on the front. And there's also chips taken out of these, which were used to assay the gold and determine its purity. These assay ingots were not refined gold. They are not pure gold. The alloy is mostly silver with various other trace elements, which trace elements form the basis of a lot of the research that Fred Hollibert and I have done since on these and other ingots in trying to determine well, the exact composition and origins and other sorts of important matters. This is a Justin Hunter ingot. So similarly, although it's in a different style and stamped in a different way, those same 5 pieces of information are also on this ingot as they were on the Kellogg and Humbert. They were all handmade. This can easily be seen in what could, I suppose, be called an error bar. Somehow or other, they messed up the calculations once, and they had a 49 stamped here, effaced it, and stamped a 52 over the top of it. You could almost hear the curses. And I like to say that the scientists have no real interest in the gold. It's not, well, of course, we're interested in it. I'm holding a Harris Marchand and Company bar in my right hand on your left, and a Kellogg and Humbert bar on the other side here. They're just marvelous pieces of history. There were nuggets on board. This is an amazing specimen. It's a piece of the mother lode, if you will. Quartz that is just shot through with veins of gold, crystalline gold at that. And I think Fred will concur that this was one of our favorite pieces since we're geologists. And you see, it was about the size of it's 10 centimeters or so across, so about 4 inches. There were other interesting personal effects. This multi-stoned ring, it turned out, after some research by my colleagues on shore, turned out to be what is known as a regard ring. Normally there would have been a ruby where the missing stone is there on the left, so it's ruby, emerald, garnet, amethyst, rose quartz, and diamond, and it spells out the word regard. It was kind of like a pre-engagement ring at the time. We have no idea who this belonged to, but it turned up in the sort of our vacuuming of the site, which is how we got a lot of the gold dust as well. In 1989, October 5th, we sailed into Norfolk, Virginia, and began the proceedings to acquire the legal rights to it. This happens in, I guess, what would be considered kind of a curious way. The gold is literally arrested by the court, and then the finders, or the salvors, depending on how you think of them, sue the vessel. So there are a lot of different entities involved here, but it is under the custody of the court. And so the United States Marshal Service first arrests the gold, and then they turn around, since it's not really their business, and assigned us as substitute custodians for the U.S. Marshals Service. We were then responsible for periodic reports to the court, and you proceed on from there. One of my favorite shots is right here. Mickey King, our chef on board, asked me for permission to wear his chef's hat and his apron because he wanted it known that he was proud to have been our cook. And I said, absolutely, Mickey, go for it. And so he's carrying his box of gold here to the Brinks truck. I also like this because can you identify the federal agents in this picture? There were court proceedings. Everything has to happen with court proceedings. As it was alluded, there was insurance that was on the SS Central America Treasure. The insurance companies sued for their rights, and we proceeded through about a 10-year process as things got ironed out. Ultimately, after we had originally been awarded 100% of the wreck, that was overturned on appeal, and we went back for a second trial based on the law of salvage instead of the law of fines, whereupon ultimately, anyway, we ended up with about 92.5%, and the underwriters ended up with about 7.5%. And it has served for a legal precedent on which future shipwreck projects can be based, because now there's actually a case law that has established this as the normal thing. But everything has to start somewhere, and that's where this started. So here I am testifying in federal court in Virginia. I had other more pleasant experiences out of this. I was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in 1991. Johnny Carson is seen here hefting that same 62-pound bar of gold that you saw in the picture of me in the newspapers. And this is an experience I will never forget. Carson was probably my favorite TV experience. He was a pro, his entire staff were pros. It just went very, very well. And it's a wonderful thing to have happen. We published a lot of our scientific findings in the Ohio Journal of Science in 1995, establishing a baseline for which all the other scientific studies, the specific studies of the individual animals or the clothing from the trunks and all of that could refer back to this for all of the background information. And this was a monograph that ran, 200 pages or so. To receive a copy of this now, you have to join the Ohio Academy of Sciences, and they give you this, or you can ask for this as your like special gift or whatever for joining. I think it costs $35 or $40 now. It's an interesting work. It was nice to have done. There were some auctions. There was an auction at Sotheby's that got put off by some last-minute legal wanglings and angered some in the numismatic community, maybe some of you in this room. But the fact was that not everything had been settled yet, and they were already having their auction. Well, never mind. I'm not going to get too much into this matter. I've been asked about this. So weren't you being rather cavalier, pouring all those gold coins out onto a table like that? Each and every one of these coins is actually separated and not touching another. It took a long time to set up this shot. This was a portion of the shot that was set up for Life magazine. Some of you have seen the reprint of Life magazine that's circulating around on the Borst floor downstairs. But there's a little tiny piece of foam in between each and every one of these coins, making sure that there's no additional bag marks. We were careful. Numismatic luminaries, in this case Jay Johnson, the at that time director of the Mint, visited the Ship of Gold exhibit, which I hope some of you may have also had the opportunity to view. This is in the assay office portion of that exhibit, which we set up with a little scale, and I'm busy showing him the ingots here. The SS Central America left a legacy in another way, and one which I suppose has a bit of controversy, but for me there was never any doubt. When these coins came up, in this case a couple of Pioneer $10 pieces, every one of them was covered to one degree or another with a certain amount of rust. The rust did not derive from anything in the coins. It was a biological and chemical deposit from all of the iron that was on the ship. And frankly, in my mind, it was disfiguring. You could not see what these coins really were in some instances. They were so coated. And borrowing from the conservation literature in other areas and tweaking around a little bit with the formulas and such, I was able to develop a conservation technique which allowed these coins, once conserved, to pass the grading standards. And they ended up in PCGS holders and have since been, many of them have sometimes been cracked out and been resubmitted. And all these coins are marvelous mint state examples. And there's no reason to fear that they have been harshly cleaned or anything else. So little effect did my chemistry have on these coins that we even found a fingerprint on one of them. So it was a great thing. Also great among it was that there were so many of them that we could be quite confident that the sample we have of the coins that were being produced at that time were around, that it allowed for dye studies of these things. Here I have the comparison of two of the U's in United that were on 1857 S double eagles. The one on the left has a full serif on the left side, and the one on the right, probably due to the reducing from the hub to the working dies, is missing that serif. So we could make comparisons between these two. We could also tell the different die states or stages that they went through. This is the broken A variety of 1857 S double eagle, the A in states here being somewhat munged up a little bit. Afterwards, here you see that there's still a slight connection in the crossbar of the A, but over here in a later die state that has been polished down on the die and does not show up in that later die state. So a lot of very detailed numismatics could come out of this as well. And the SS Central America, the greatest lost treasure in the history of our country, is now, I hope, in the hands of a very happy numismatic community. Thank you for your attention and for having me here. Thank you to the ANA. And I will entertain 5 questions before we have to let the next folks come on in, and let's do it. Afterwards, I will be available for, personal questions, if you will. Thank you very much.